it's a 2 for day. So I called it a night, and I'm getting ready to make some soup, some corn chowder. But before I do that, I wanted to mostly make this maybe as a note for myself and people who appreciate my gardening talks. I'm going to keep this sort of short. But I wanted just to sort of share this out because I think there's some useful thoughts to kind of keep in the back of our mind for a rainy day. So today went out and I got my 6 bins of compost, which is about as much as will fit in my Subaru. And I mixed up the rest of my soil in the beds that I dug a few days ago, which is good. And then I was going to get started finishing the last bed around the area that I'm going to have my raised bed gardens in. And I think I'm going to put garlic in there. But I just couldn't get motivated to do more digging today. And I ended up thinking maybe on the new soil that I had gotten all prepped up against the fence line, I would go in and remove the irises that were under those crazy big crepe myrtle hedges. And I don't know if people, like I have a blog about it, I have some pictures if you want to picture it, but against in my backyard, there's sort of, it was a privacy hedge, it's not so private anymore. And maybe one of these more shrubbery crepe myrtles, there are about 8 of them. And they had been cut off at the base several times. They were crazily outgrowing their space. They're like, every bush had like 60 stalks on it, and they were all competing with each other. There was no airflow, and they had gotten this scale disease, which was really gross. And then it attracted aphids, and then the aphid sticky stuff made fungus. And so really these crepe myrtle shrubs that I think were put in maybe 8 years ago were just like big bunches of gray, dusty stuff in the back. And so over the past month or so, I've cleared them out. Now they each are just about 9 stalks. And I'm hopefully going to clean them out and do some sort of treatment next spring to stop the scale. This is some sort of alien invasive scale. But as I was gradually clearing all of this out, and I initially had to do it because it was all overgrown with honeysuckle and English ivy and some poison ivy, not too much, fortunately. And as I was excavating the poison ivy corner, I found that there were actually buried in the sod and almost invisible were irises. And these same irises extended under the crepe myrtle hedge. And so this is sort of my story. I want to talk a little bit about the irises today. So essentially, if you can picture it, the backyard is straight, and it's got these 8 crepe myrtle hedges and then a little bit extra, which is the poison ivy corner that I cleared out. And there's a narrow band. So on the very back of my yard is a little ditch, a drainage ditch, because I'm on a slope and there's a lot of water that comes off the little mountain behind us. And then right before the drainage ditch is the hedge, and they were planted in essentially like a flower bed. Maybe, I don't even think they were 3 feet wide, maybe 2.5 feet wide, and they were lined with these scalloped edge concrete edging blocks, and those had gotten all gray too from sitting under the aphid droppings and whatever. And so I lifted all of the remaining blocks up, which was a good heavy lift. They're each about 2 feet long, concrete. So I had about 15 of those that I was able to successfully extricate from the roots of the crepe myrtles and move out of the way. So now I can properly mulch them and get in there to weed them and mow when necessary. But in that space, in that little in-between space, were even more iris. And I remember when I first was trying to deal with these bushes and figure out what needed to be done, and I was clearing out some of the biggest underbrush under the shrubs, because they really grew straight down to the ground. There wasn't a lot of open space to get in there. But there was this strange pod, and I did not know what to make of this pod. It was a stalk, like maybe 18 inches long, with this prominent pod. And I thought, oh, is that like a lily? What is this dried pod? But anyway, I put it in the compost, and that's that. But ultimately, when I was looking at the seed pods of irises, I think those little irises that were buried under the stinky diseased crepe myrtles were not only surviving, but occasionally throwing off a blossom and going to seed and making a seed pod. So go iris. And so anyway, it took me a few hours and I was able to lift all the irises out from under the hedge and around where they had been shoehorned in between these paver blocks and put them in a wheelbarrow. And then I was excited. So I was like, I had already planted some iris in the front yard where I can see them up against the fence. And those seemed happy. And now I have more. There were probably like 100 rhizomes of the iris. And so I ended up installing some in the new bed, and they need sun, so finding little places, and I'd size them. So there were the very robust ones, and then there were ones that were maybe just like the length of my finger, and then there were the little baby ones, but I got them all tucked in, including the teeny tiniest ones that I put in the back corner to grow up a little bit. And so the message that I wanted to share with you tonight, because again, I get these ideas, maybe wacky ideas as I'm out gardening. I've mentioned before, I have this childhood memory of the first house. I wasn't born in this house, but I was maybe 1 when we moved in, and it had a garage, and it was lined with big bearded purple irises that my mom would send me to kindergarten with them cut and then wrapped in tinfoil and wet paper towels. And I have this great memory of these irises. So it's sort of like coming back to the little girlness of Allison and the irises. So I planted them up along the fence. Now I have them spread out in the yard. And I felt just like a kinship with these irises. It's sort of like a little welcome home. And this sense of abundance, right? And a gift, because I didn't even know they were there. And I had to hack through all of these layers of effort to like the weeds and the overgrown grass and then thinning the bushes out. And then it took phases to get there. But after a month, I could pull them out of their dark corner and give them a place in the sun, right? And so I think for all of us who are maybe going through difficult times, I think that's a really potent message of the iris to us today, is that, even if you feel like you're stuck under some sort of disease, drippy thing and you don't have what you need, hopefully you can persevere, and then someday some new owner is going to show up and clear away all the nonsense, and then lift you up and put you in a sunny spot where you can hopefully thrive and find enjoyment in where you're actually supposed to be. So anyway, that's the message that I am taking from the iris today. And then the thing about the iris is, I didn't know this at the time. So initially, when I was doing research, my early research in social impact finance and impact investing, and one of the centers for impact investing, this is all undergirded by the Rockefeller Foundation, were these benefit corporations. And there was something called the B Lab that was sort of providing support for the creation of the field of benefit corporations, like Ben and Jerry's and charter schools and different things that are supposed to provide a social good. And the building for the B Lab was out in Villanova. And so I've been out there and I've set some intentions out there. And so the B Lab and the Rockefeller Foundation impact finance folks were setting up something called GIIN, like the Global Impact Investment Network. But it's very interesting, the wordplay here, because it's like GIN, or you could also imagine it as the DJINN, like a djinn or a genie, right? And so there's this sort of mythological overtones on this. And so the djinn, everything runs on metrics, right? That's the cybernetic world, is that everything runs on a data dashboard. So they needed the standardization of impact and the social impact, and that was laid out with a lot of various philanthropic support. And the system of the impact measurement was called IRIS. So at the time, I knew it as like iris as the eye. And it's interesting to think about, the eye, because before I've talked a little bit about, the qualia and our sense of self, and then how we perceive the world through our senses. And the eye is really central to that. And I didn't realize till I started doing a little bit more research about the optic nerve. And really, the optic nerve is like the brain reaching out to the outer world to make contact from the brain within through the optic nerve without. And the blood-brain barrier there's also a blood barrier for the optic nerve, right? To like keep you focused on this reality. And so it's interesting thinking about the iris also as the eye, and the iris regulates light coming in. So there's the light aspect of both me giving light to the iris, but then also it was a sunny day. And even though there was a lot of stuff going on up in the sky, I was just centering on abundance of these irises, these precious little irises that I had. And so there's the sensing aspect of the iris, and then also iridology, which I learned about from my friend Sean, which is looking at the iris for evidence of problems with your health or well-being or that sort of thing. And the other iris thing that I remember is in talking with Emily Moyer, we've talked before about heterochromia or partial heterochromia, which is that your iris might have different colors in them. And I can't remember exactly what I know Emily has some very specific things that she thinks about heterochromia being related to some of the processing systems, information processing, and people having different kinds of eyes. But all of this was coming through the iris, and then again, you've got the iris being the god or goddess, or I don't know, demigod maybe. I don't think it was like one of the top gods, but the messenger of the gods, actually. And so the iris was carrying something from the earth up to the gods, and it was carried on the rainbow. So that's interesting in terms of all of the sustainable development goals, but the back and forth. And the other thing that iris was known for is, I guess, in some myths, that when the gods had to give an oath, that she would have a ewer of water from the river Styx that they would have to drink before they giving their oath, because if they lied under oath, they would be unconscious for a year, and they didn't want to have that. So she was the water bearer for the river Styx, which is of the underworld. And again, here I'm here on the flank of West Mountain, which is sort of the underworld mountain range in the West. So yeah, so so that was the stuff about iris. And I also wanted to talk for a second about rhizomes, because the iris, if you're not familiar with, if you're not a gardening kind of person, the iris grow from rhizomes, and it's a certain kind of fleshy root. And so if you go to the grocery store and you see whole ginger, that is a rhizome. But irises are also rhizomes, and there's a lot of sort of philosophy about the rhizome. So I'm going to play a little bit of this video about the philosophy of the rhizome from Deleuze and Guattari. I think that they had done this idea of rhizomatic thinking in the 80s, the late 80s, I think, and linking information flows to the idea of the rhizome. And probably if people out there are watching and scratching their head and they're like, why do I keep coming back to this channel? It seems so irrelevant. Like, this woman, how she thinks is so rhizomatic, right? Because that's where my operating system is that there's not a beginning or an end. We're always in the middle, and we're always in process, and all the things connect to all the other things. So I think that was one of the things that exasperated my ex-husband, was that everything was interconnected. and that's too much for people with different operating systems to handle. So for me, I was always doing this tentacular rhizomatic thinking and putting together things like wasp bioprompting and galls on plant leaves with morphic resonance, and how that might relate to digital currency and wisdom of the crowd, stigmergic swarm intelligence. And people would say, those things don't go together. And I would say, but in the rhizome world, they do, and they can. So let's just listen to this quick clip about the rhizome as a way of thinking.
Is a concept developed by Deleuze and Guattari that can be defined as an A-centered multiplicity. Wait, what? What does that mean? Okay, multiplicities can be understood as neither subject nor object, only magnitudes and dimensions that can't increase in number without changing in nature. Take temperature, for example. 80 degrees Fahrenheit has a certain feeling to it. Any adding or subtracting of degrees results in a different feeling. Compare that to, say, adding or subtracting from a bag of marbles. Whether you add to it or take from it, it's still a bag of marbles. This is a quantitative difference versus a multiplicity, which is more of a qualitative difference.
So for me, what jumps out at this point is, in the world of the world sensorium, is the idea of qualitative and qualia and our sensing, right? And again, thinking about the iris, thinking about the eye, thinking about the message to the gods, the other space, the other info space out there, and it happening through light and color and sensing. So yeah, but it's qualitative, not quantitative. So the qualia is important.
So anyway, that's a multiplicity, and while a rhizome is just a bunch of multiplicities put together in a way that has no structure at all. So why is the concept of the rhizome useful? Well, to think with it is to unveil the many ways that you can approach a thought or activity.
Right. And so this is many ways of thinking about it, right? And not just one way of thinking about it. Although we do kind of live in a reality tunnel. So for us, we tend to prioritize one way of thinking about it. But if you can kind of get a metacognitive level and step out of your reality tunnel and maybe dip into some other reality tunnels, you can look at things from different dimensions. And so I think that's really important. And here, this image of the question mark, I did briefly have an exchange today with someone, and I said, if at this point, and again, this is just my opinion, take it for what it's worth, but in how I'm thinking about things, if anyone shows up and they say, here, I know what it is. It's this. I have the answer. Listen to me, because I know. And I would be, because of the complexity of what we're navigating and the ambiguity and the hidden nature of so many things, I would just, I would be cautious about anybody who thinks they have it all dialed in, because that means that they've essentially picked one reality tunnel and they're not really entertaining anything else from anything else. So I would far prefer people who offer ideas onto the table and say, sort of, these are patterns that I'm seeing, and then asking questions about it, than to say that we have all the answers. So again, just my public interest statement for the day is I think questions over answers is maybe prudent at this stage.
Helps question hierarchies and binaries, and provides us with a way to see how everything can be multiple and interrelated. To illustrate this concept, let's compare a tree with ginger. First, imagine a tree with roots extending into the ground, a trunk coming up out of the ground, and branches that go into the sky. Thinking has been historically imagined like this, based on the idea of hierarchies and categorizations. Much of Western philosophy stems from this thinking and can be seen in the structure of our schools, corporations, and even things like child development theories.
So in this, what's interesting to me about this is, again, it implies a linearity, a specific progression, the hierarchy. And the more that I'm poking around in the space of like non-local consciousness and imagining this idea of, I don't know, like a daimon, the Trinity, like an interface between you and other forms of information, I feel like the idea of epiphanies and inspirations that are not linear is more interesting to think about. And we know that this happens a lot within the artistic community, and even in science and engineering. A lot of people come up with these breakthrough ideas, but it's not from a logical progression. It simply like arrives in mind, and then they have the idea or the vision of what they want to create or what they want to make. And so I think that the non-local decentralized aspect is interesting.
All of these present a beginning, which is at the bottom, and one desired end to meet at the top. Where the tree is rooted in...
And so I would say the one desired end and the linearity does relate somewhat to the cybernetics and the socio-technical systems, is that they're gearing us. There might be multiple branches to get to the destination, but there is a specific destination where within the rhizome, it's all woven together, but there's not a beginning or an end. It's just a continuum.
Logical, ginger growth really doesn't make any sense at all. It has no top or bottom and goes off in every which way. Deleuze and Guattari describe 6 characteristics of the rhizome. Notice how they fit the image of ginger. Connectivity and heterogeneity means that any point can be connected to any other, no matter how similar or different. Multiplicity, remember temperature. Asignifying rupture, which means the rhizome can be broken off at any point, but it'll always start up again. And cartography and decalcomania, which makes us think of the rhizome as a map, something that's always open and can be entered at any point.
I feel like I need to spend some time looking at decalcomania. Because again, my intuition says it feels like some of what this team building for crowdsourced wisdom swarm intelligence is a navigation program, and that maybe this idea of having all of the children in the Montessori pre-K have sensors in their slippers to track their movements around the classroom is that there's going to be some equivalency if, again, in my thought experiment, there is a two-phase astral projection system that if you go out into to do that projection, that there's something recording your travels back in. And so anyway, that's sort of what I'm thinking about the cartography and the mapping. And again, the ruptures that you can break apart and it will sprout again. And that's the thing about the rhizome. A lot of them are very fleshy, these irises, although there were two different kinds, and I have no idea what the flowers are going to look like or if they'll bloom next year. They might need more time. But some were very bulbous and then some were more flat. But when you grow iris, and I had to do this even under these bushes, they grow together. They intertwine and then sort of entangle on one another, but in a lumpy sort of way. And over time, if you don't keep dividing them, they'll lose vigor and they'll die off. And so what you need to do is every few years you lift the mound of the iris rhizomes out of the ground, and then you pull them apart. And I guess even if like for me, there were some that were not easily separated by hand, and then I had to use like my spade and cut it. But even with the cut, it self-heals and then starts again. So I think that the idea of like these resilient cities or resilient systems are based in sort of the, even it's kind of like the planaria, right? I was talking about Michael Levin and the morphic fields in the planaria, that the breakage self-seals and then starts again. So it is an abundant, expansive system, but it's without beginning or end.
Think about it. Is there really a starting point to reading a map? What these 6 characteristics help us see is that the rhizome is not just a thing, but probably more of a process.
And again, for me, the process is like Albert North Whitehead and the process reality and the becomingness, right? It is in motion. And, you know, when I talked with Joseph about the work he's doing on quantum consciousness, and one of the things that he was thinking is that the idea of time is within a 3D space that we occupy, and I do think that the heart is central to keeping that time, like that our heart keeps us in time because it's the timekeeper of the body. But at the tippy top, if consciousness is the pre-existing condition and it wants to separate itself and experience all of these things, which is like Bohm's explicate order, that one of the things to experience would be causality, and that requires time, and time is a process. So the rhizome, I guess, in a way, like when I'm lifting up this interconnected bunch of rhizomes that are all on top of each other, it's like lifting up an artifact of a process, of a developmental process itself.
An immanent process that allows us to question hierarchical organization. The rhizome's emphasis is not on what is or what was, but more on what can become of it. Some other illustrations of rhizomes might be the internet, especially a website like Wikipedia, or crabgrass. These things don't have a central root,
I have some crabgrass too,
origin, or logical pattern to their growth. These examples and their rootlessness help us envision how we might oppose what has been called rational approaches to knowledge. To think with the rhizome is to give up, at least for a little, beginnings and endings, tops and bottoms, and that comfortable shade of the tree.
So I just want to say, like giving up the comfort, right? Giving up living in the unknowing space, which is something that I've felt really strongly, like being involved in the public education space, that taking away imagination or taking away possibility, even if it's not immediately provable, is a tremendous loss, like from kids in schools is what I'm primarily thinking. It, like taking the imagination, taking away libraries, taking away fiction, putting in nonfiction, having everything be very procedural and technical, and then again the move into STEM, which is everything according to a scientific method, right? And so I mean, theoretically, good science should have lots of questions, and you should be able to ask questions and have sort of open questions hanging. Like even, math has all of these like open challenges and questions that we haven't quite figured out yet. But I feel like embracing the space of uncertainty and possibility at this point in time is really important, rather than trying to have everything all dialed in at once. Because I think holding that space for imagination and potential and communication with other kinds of life in the universe is really important. And this sort of wraps up that's sort of the end of this little 3-minute video that I want to share. But for me, being open meant being in conversation today with the iris, right? And then taking time to be quiet enough in myself and my own thinking, and not being distracted by other digital information feeds and different things. It's just like, what was the iris trying to say to me, right? And then what was my relationship to the iris? Because for the most part, the rhizomes, sometimes they get a little withered and holes, and then are diseased, and you don't want to like reuse those. But there were only maybe 4 pieces of like not optimal rhizome out of under all of those 8 bushes. There were probably at least 100 different pieces of rhizome that I pulled out of there. And, and I planted them all by the end of the day, even the little tiniest ones, even maybe the babies from that, some prior dried seed pod that was thrust up under the hedge. And so I think being open to like unexpected messaging is valuable, and I think it can make us happy, even if what I'm doing was doing under a sky full of white lines, that there is something at the bottom is something beautiful, and that we do have hope for a future of where we're out of the shadow and we get to enjoy the rays of the sun and have the divine sun kiss our faces and give us a little color, and give us a day with a good workout, and just a little bit of happiness. So take from this what you will. But if you always wonder, that Alison McDowell, I'm just not sure what to make of her. You could just say she's a rhizomatic thinker. She's an eclectic rhizomatic thinker, and there it is. That's me. All right. Good night, everybody.